Hey, good morning. As Kelly said, my name is Graeme. I come here from 10th Church out in Vancouver. It is a blessing to be with you here this morning. It was just nice, even just to drive out of the city today with the sun and all the nature that we get to enjoy here. As she also said, my role at 10th is I'm the pastor of youth ministry there, and it is, I see maybe some irony in inviting the youth pastor out to talk to you today about rules. As I was preparing for today, I was reminded of some of the rules my brother and I had growing up in our home. We had the same rules that maybe some of you had. Things like you have to have a glass of water at dinner before you can have juice, or no shoes in the house, or there were limits on how much video games we could play in a day. But one rule that, looking back on now, that was a little strange was our bedtime. And it's difficult for me to describe what this looks like or what this rule was without sounding like I grew up in a convent, so bear with me here. I grew up in a very small farming community outside of Edmonton, about 400 people. And every day at 12 and 9 p.m., a siren would go off in the town that was loud enough for the entire town to hear. Originally, years before I was around, this was a way to notify farmers working out in the field that it was time to come in for lunch. And then at 9, it was a notification to come back in and be done for the day. And by the time I was a kid and I was around, it was more of a novelty than anything. And although it did alarm anybody new to town, I remember my friend's mom, who the day they moved into their house thought an air raid was happening. But the 9 o'clock siren became the signal to my parents that it was time for my brother and I to go to bed. And so we'd be in the living room, my brother and I watching TV, and the siren would go off, and we kind of sit there, kind of tense, waiting for my mom in the other room to go, "Boys, time for bed." We were hoping that some nights she wouldn't hear it, maybe, or she'd be distracted and she wouldn't hear it, and we get to stay up a little bit longer. Now, today, 20-some years later, I'll have evenings where I'll look at the clock and I see that it's close to 9 or it's around that time, and I kind of tighten up, waiting for the siren to go off. And I live downtown Vancouver now, which would be a much different situation if a siren went off. I think there's something about rules that we're drawn to. There are bad, unhelpful rules, of course, but good rules give us a sense of clarity. They tell us where the lines are. They tell us what's expected of us. On our way here this morning, we all had particular rules that we follow, regardless if you drove or you biked or you walked or you took the bus here. There were guidelines and expectations that were expected of you to follow, at least not too many kilometers over the guidelines. And I think there's something comforting about that I like. Like, if I know the rules, then I usually can figure out where it is that I stand. If I follow the rules, I'm good. If I don't follow the rules, I may not be good. But I think for me, I'd wonder if there are others like me here where I've brought this feeling of needing some rules into my faith at points. If you grew up like I did, with or without the sirens, you may have had influences in your life that could make Jesus, unintentionally or not, feel like just simply keeping track of a list of things. You're just like, read my Bible, pray more, go to church, be kind, be patient, don't be selfish, tell the truth, don't take what's not yours. And I'd imagine for a lot of us in this room, we would agree that those are generally good things to do, or to follow, or to believe at least. But in seasons of my life, there would be moments where, despite checking all of the right boxes, doing all of the right things, that it actually wasn't changing that much in me. Maybe you're like me, where you've learned on the outside to look patient, but inwardly be incredibly annoyed and bitter. Or you've started some kind of Bible reading plan in the first few days. It was really good. You were getting it done. But by day 8 or 9, you're kind of just making your eyes move across the page if you're still doing it at all. I think I'm not alone in knowing what it's like to be doing all of the right spiritual things and still feel disconnected from God in some way, right? Maybe at some point, we have been sold a version of Christianity that was more concerned with behavior management than actually drawing us closer to the one who brings transformation. So my hope for us today is that we can discover that even the best rules we can place on ourselves can't do the work of transforming our desires like Jesus can. This passage in Colossians 2 was just read for us earlier, and it's where we'll be reading this morning. And in this passage, Paul is writing to this whole letter is writing to a group of people who were, in one way or another, suggesting that Jesus wasn't quite enough. It was a setting perhaps like one I just described, perhaps like ones that we've caught ourselves in being before, where we say, hey, Jesus is good. But if you really want to be spiritual, if you want to be in the inner circle of Jesus, if that's something that exists, you need to have these like extra rules. And I think this is a really important thing to be paying attention to, and why I'm glad we're talking about this today, because I think some of the most dangerous versions of Christianity that we can have don't sound like a rejection of Jesus. They sound like Jesus plus something else. Jesus plus my performance, Jesus plus my spiritual disciplines, Jesus plus my ability to look better than I actually am. And Paul is writing to remind this church that if something starts to take the place of Jesus, even if it looks spiritual, it can't give them life. Let's read verse 16 here again. He says, therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. Paul says, don't let anyone judge you, not by what you eat or drink, or what days you observe, or what practices you keep, because, Paul says next, these are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. You know, a shadow, at least in this context, isn't a bad thing. A shadow really is just evidence. A shadow tells you something is there, but it's not the thing itself. What that means is that now that Jesus has come, the Colossians don't need to cling to the shadows as if it were the substance. My wife is a wedding and family photographer, and recently we took a trip down to the Oregon coast for a couple shoots that she had down there. And if you've been down there, you know how incredible of a place it is. When I got to Cannon Beach, this is it for the first time, and I saw this beach, I almost drove off the road. I was just so in awe of what I was seeing. But could you imagine if my wife Sasha and we drove all the way down to Oregon, we waited at the border, we fought through the traffic in Seattle, we crossed into Portland, we made our way over to the coast, and we finally got to the sign that says, welcome to Cannon Beach, and we got there and we just pulled over. Just the whole afternoon, just admiring this sign, rather than going to where the sign is pointing to. That would be ridiculous. And we would think that's ridiculous in how we travel, but so often we embrace it when it comes to our spiritual journey. And please don't mishear me. I'm going to say this a lot today. Please don't mishear me. Prayer is good. Serving is good. Being part of a spiritual community like this one consistently is good. But the only reason those things are good is because they create space for us to be with the one who is ultimately good. I think a lot of the time when this kind of thinking happens to us, it doesn't begin with something obviously bad. It begins with a good desire to honor God or a meaningful way to do this, and in our brokenness, we end up distorting it if we're not careful. And Paul keeps going on in verse 18 by warning them not to let anyone disqualify them through any kind of spirituality that looks impressive on the outside. He talks about false humility and spiritual experiences and people who seem to have a deeper religious insight than anyone else. And he goes on in verse 19 and he says that the real problem is that they have lost connection with the head. And the head is Christ. That's the issue Paul keeps coming back to and what we'll continue to come back to in this passage. It is possible for any of us in this room to look spiritual, to have all the practices, have all the rules, all the experiences, all the language, and still be drifting from the one who it was all meant to drive us towards. So Paul's concern is not just that we have too many rules. His concern is that these rules are not actually keeping them connected to Jesus. You know, I heard this illustration a few years ago that might be helpful. He said, imagine if someone were to make a rule to say, don't sit in the red chair. I brought up a red chair. I didn't have one today. If I brought up a red chair here today and I said, don't sit in the red chair, that's the rule. And we all like, hey, clear enough, seems good. Red chair, don't do it. Sounds good. We got to respect the rule. That seems good. And then because people don't want to try to accidentally break the rule, they start creating extra distance around it. So instead of just avoiding the one red chair, they decide that it's safer just to avoid all red chairs in case they may screw up somehow and get the wrong chair. So just all red chairs are out. And then we start to go, you know what? Actually maybe like purple and orange chairs are like kind of red. So we're going to get rid of all orange and purple chairs as well. We can't mess that up. And then we go, you know what? Actually, we can't know that the green chair was once painted red. So we got to get rid of all chairs now. We can't have any chairs. We can't avoid this. We have to avoid this mistake at all costs. And then after a while, we start avoiding couches too because they're close enough to chairs. And then eventually, in an effort to avoid breaking the original rule, the safest thing seems to just be to get rid of all furniture. And we're left standing in an empty home. What can start as a genuine desire to be faithful can slowly start to turn into a way of life that is mostly shaped by fear. We move from asking, how can I live close to God, or how can I live with Christ at the head of my life? We start asking, how far away can I stay from anything that might possibly be wrong? And that can look wise on the surface, but underneath, it can quietly train us to believe that the goal of faith is simply just avoidance. And again, boundaries are good things to have. Wisdom means being able to say that I know where that road goes, I'm not going to walk down it. But the problem is that avoiding the red chair doesn't actually teach us how to love what is good. Getting rid of all furniture might mean I never sit in the wrong chair, but it also leaves me with a pretty empty house. Paul's concern for the Colossians is that he is looking at a version of spirituality that keeps adding rules and boundaries and restrictions, and it looks serious and impressive, but is actually not doing anything to lead people to a full life with Christ. And then Paul goes on in this passage saying, since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. We can imagine a kind of concern in Paul's voice here. He's asking them, why would they go back to building their lives around the rules when Christ has already set them free? In that phrase, since you died with Christ is really important in this. Paul is saying that when you belong to Jesus, something about your old way of living has to come to an end. For those of us who have accepted the gift Jesus has offered us on the cross, we are not the same people that we used to be. It means we're not living under the same powers or the same shame or the same fear. We don't live with the same need to prove ourselves before God, and that's good news. So Paul is asking, if the old way has died, why would you go back to living like it has any authority over you? Why would you return to a version of faith where you're standing with God, rises and falls on whether or not you touched the wrong thing or ate the wrong thing or avoided the wrong thing or kept the right list? I'm going to say this again. A good rule can do a lot for us. Rules can keep us safe, create helpful boundaries, and put distance between us and certain behaviors we don't want to have part of our life anymore. But as much as a rule can do, what it can never do is change what we love. It can keep us from sitting in the red chair or maybe even keep us from going near the chair, but it cannot transform the part of us that is still obsessed with the chair. And that's where the rules start to reach their limit. Rules can manage the outside of our lives, but they cannot heal the inside of us. A rule can tell me not to be jealous, but it can't heal the insecurity that makes me compare myself to everybody else. A rule can tell me not to chase approval, but it can't convince my heart that I'm already loved by God. A rule can tell me not to go back to a destructive habit, but it can't meet me in the loneliness and stress and shame or pain that keeps pulling me into that habit in the first place. And I think this is where many of us get frustrated with our spiritual lives. We assume that if we just had the right rule or the right system or the right routine and like just the right amount of discipline, then finally things will be different. And those things may help for a while, and they certainly can help in the wholeness of what we're in the journey for, but they may give us structure, and and sometimes that structure is genuinely a gift, but structure is not the same as transformation. Being contained is not the same thing as being made whole. Holiness does not come from fear-based avoidance. It comes from being joined to Christ. It comes from staying connected to the one who can actually change us from the inside out. Because the rules can restrain behavior, but only Christ can transform desire. That's essentially what Paul says in verse 23 here. He says, such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. In other words, Paul is saying these rules can look wise, but they cannot actually deal with the deeper desires underneath. We can do a really good job of using our rules to look serious and look spiritual, but we're also really good at assuming the person that has the strictest boundaries in the room is the one who's taking God the most seriously. But Paul is saying that we need to pay attention to what these rules are actually able to do. Again, these can create the appearance of control, but they are not able to deal with the deeper desires underneath. And ultimately, I believe and I think today that this is good news for us. Because Paul is not saying that we will stop caring about how we live. He is saying that we will stop trusting something powerless to save us. Because of who Jesus is, we have hope in something deeper than the rules we make for ourselves. Our spiritual disciplines can create space for God, but it cannot replace who God is. A boundary can help us walk with wisdom, but it cannot be the source of our transformation. And that matters because some of us are sitting here this morning exhausted from trying to hold ourselves together. We've ran ourselves ragged, trying to be consistent enough, disciplined enough, strong enough, aware enough, and clear-headed enough to keep ourselves on track by our own power. But the good news this morning you might need to hear is that the Christian life was never designed to be sustained by our own ability to hold everything together. If following Jesus depended on us having enough strength or enough consistency or enough discipline or enough clarity on our own, we would eventually run out, and this would not be good news. And some of us, I'd imagine, know what it feels like to run out. We know what it feels like to try hard for a while, make promises to ourselves, create new routines and systems, and slowly realize that we need something deeper than self-management. And the good news of Colossians is that Jesus is not one more piece of spiritual advice. He is not just one more religious practice to fit into an already busy life. Friends, Christ is the substance. He is the reality that all the shadows were pointing towards. He is the head of which the whole body grows from. So our invitation today is not just to become stricter or more careful, it's just to come back to Christ. It's to stay connected to him. It's to let him into the places that we have been mostly just trying to manage by ourselves. Because the deepest parts of us are not transformed by fear or performance or restriction. Again, rules can restrain behavior, but only Christ can transform desire. So maybe the question for us today, this morning, isn't do rules matter? Because of course they do in some sense. The question is more, what am I asking the rules to do in my life? Am I using them as wisdom that helps me create space for God, or am I using them as a way to prove to myself and to others that I'm okay or I'm good in some way? Because I think for a lot of us, this can show up in ways that are pretty subtle. It might show up in the way we think about our spiritual disciplines, or we think about the ways in which we engage in this stuff. When we read our Bible or pray or serve, again, good things, but somewhere along the way, maybe for us, they become less about being with Jesus and more about proving to ourselves and others that we're doing well. Or maybe it shows up in the ways that we respond when we fail. When we mess up, or we fall back into an old pattern, or don't live up to the person we thought we were becoming. And instead of bringing it honestly to Jesus, what we do is we immediately start building a new system or a stricter plan or a clear boundary or another promise to ourselves that this will be the time it'll be different. And again, that might be what part of wisdom looks like in some ways. There may be, for some of us, boundaries that we need to set, or habits that we can build, or patterns that we can take more seriously. But the invitation of this passage and for us today is for us to recognize that these things were never meant to become the place where we put our hope. Because if the only thing we ever do is make more rules, we might be able to manage what people see for a while. But Jesus is inviting us to bring him what is underneath all of that. Not just the behavior, but the desire, the fear, the insecurity, the shame, the longing, the part of us that keeps reaching for things that we know aren't giving us life. So maybe for us today, the invitation is to stop hiding behind the appearance of having it all together. Maybe for us this morning, we've been doing the right things, showing up to the right places, saying the right words, and from the outside, your life feels fairly controlled, but underneath, maybe for some of us, we've never felt further from Jesus than we do today. Or maybe for you, the invitation is to stop letting your failure become the loudest voice in your relationship with God. Maybe you've been carrying a sense with you of like, I should be better by now, or I should be past this by now. Someone like me can't be struggling with this thing still. It feels like more evidence that you're not really changing. And today, we can be reminded that our hope is not in our ability to transform ourselves. Friends, our hope is in Christ. And Christ is not only interested in making us look different on the outside, he is able to meet us in the places we've been trying to manage on our own. I think for us, a really simple prayer for us this morning can just be, Jesus, I don't just need better rules. I need you to change what I love. Maybe let's just do this right now. Let's just pray this for a moment. Jesus, I don't just need better rules. I need you to change what I love. It's a simple prayer. It's only 15 words, and none of them are more than 2 syllables. But it's a vulnerable one. Because it means giving Jesus access to more than our behavior. It means letting him into the places that we usually try to keep hidden. But the good news is that Jesus does not meet us there with disgust or disappointment. We serve a God who meets us in those gaps with grace, with patience, and with presence. He meets us with a kind of love that is strong enough to tell us the truth without crushing us under the weight of it. I think this morning we have a chance to ask ourselves, where have I been trying to manage myself instead of coming honestly to Jesus? For us this morning, it could be in your anger. It could be in your comparison. It could be in your need for approval. It could be in your habits, your spiritual life, your family, your work, your thought life, or just some part of your life where you've built more and more rules but still feel stuck underneath. And the next faithful step doesn't have to be leaving here with just one more thing to add to your list. It's taking the next faithful step to come back to Christ and to say, I have been trying to handle this on my own for far too long. And I need you to create something deeper in me than I could ever hope to make in myself. And if we actually lived this way together, I think this would change the kind of community that we could become. Because we would still take holiness seriously without becoming harsh. We would still care about obedience, but we would not use it as a way to measure who belongs and who doesn't. We would be able to encourage each other towards Jesus without crushing each other with shame. We would be able to say hard things when needed, but with the humility of people who know that none of us are being held together by our own strength. This church is not a community of people who have become really impressive by managing themselves. It is a community of people who are learning slowly and honestly to bring more and more of ourselves to Jesus. That means spiritual practices still matter. They help us stay connected to Christ, not because they become a replacement for him. One of the stories I'm reminded by preparing today is from Les Miserables. Early in the story, If you've seen the musical before, Jean Valjean has just been released from prison. He had spent years being punished, watched, controlled, and marked by what he's done. And you would think, after all of that, maybe prison would have made him a new person. Maybe after all of those consequences, he would have now been changed from the inside out. But when he gets out, he is still the same angry, hardened, desperate person that he was when he came in, and everyone believes him still to be. And eventually he gets taken in by a bishop, and this bishop gives him food and a place to sleep. And in the middle of the night, Valjean steals his silver and runs off. And the police catch him and drag him back. And everything in this story feels like it should go the obvious way. He stole, he got caught, now he should be punished again. But the bishop does something that Valjean and maybe any of us would expect. Instead of condemning him, he tells them that the silver was a gift. And then he goes and gives them even more. And I think what makes this moment so powerful is that the bishop does not act like Valjean. What he did was fine. He knows exactly what happened, but he also sees something more than just theft. He sees a man who needs more than another punishment. He sees a man who needs grace deep enough to interrupt the story he has been living and telling himself. And that moment becomes the beginning of Valjean's transformation. And it didn't happen because rules finally scared him enough, or because punishment finally broke through to him, but it's because grace reached somewhere where rules could never. And I think that is the picture of the kind of community that the church is meant to be. Not a community where sin doesn't matter, because it certainly does. Not a community where obedience does not matter, but a community where we keep pointing each other back to the one who actually makes us new. Imagine if this church was a place where we could be honest about where we are still being changed. Where someone can genuinely say that I am struggling, and instead of being met with shock or distance, they were met by people who knows what it means to need Jesus too. Imagine if we could be a people where we help each other build wise boundaries, but not confuse those boundaries for salvation. Where we could encourage spiritual disciplines, but not turn them into some kind of scoreboard. Where we call each other towards obedience, but we keep pointing each other back to the one who actually transforms us. Friends, that is what is available for us today. Christ above all. Christ above our performance. Christ above our self-effort. Christ above our shame, Christ above our spiritual image, and Christ above every system we use to make ourselves feel safe. Not because rules don't matter, but because the rules were never meant to save us. They were never meant to become the substance or the destination or the source of transformation. Friends, only Jesus can carry that weight, and that is really good news. I mentioned earlier that I live downtown in Vancouver, and when I'm close to English Bay, and whenever I'm walking my dog down there, I see these sailboats in the water almost all the time. You've been down there, you know what that's like. And the thing about sailboats is that you can have everything set up perfectly. You can have your sail up, the direction's clear, you know exactly where it is that you want to go. And that's what it's like. But without the wind, you're not moving. And that's what it's like to live on knowledge and rules alone. You can know all the right things and still feel stuck. But the God that we serve this morning is like the wind and the sails. He is the one that actually moves you. He's the one who guides you, the one who carries you forward. And the invitation we have today is to not try harder to move the boat ourselves. We get to raise the sail and learn to rely on the wind. So today, We don't have to leave this space simply trying to build better systems for ourselves. We get to leave here today recentering our hope in Christ. Today, let's come back to him. Let's stay connected to him and let him into the places where we have been mostly trying to just manage ourselves. Because rules can restrain behavior, but only Christ can transform desire. Jesus, I'm just struck by how much we need you. Lord, for the ways in which we've tried to save ourselves, we repent. I'm struck by, I feel like there's a sense for us where there are things that we have built for ourselves, little kingdoms we built for ourselves that you are ready to break through into. So as we respond here this morning, bring us closer to you. Draw us back to you being the head. Let our rules and our boundaries and our habits have the place they need to be, and let you be at the center. God, with all of our hearts, we long for you. Amen.